Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another literary journey that will transport us to ancient times, where humanity's most precious lessons are revealed through simple gestures and generous hearts. Today, we will share the story of The Man of the Storm, a narrative that teaches us about the true essence of fatherhood, unconditional love, and the courage to do what is right, even when the world around us seems to crumble. Amidst the merciless droughts of the interior of Minas Gerais, we will discover how a simple act of compassion can transform destinies and perpetuate good through generations. Before we begin, tell me, where are you joining us from? Leave your city in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like so more people can know these stories that touch the soul. Year 1882, region of Patos de Minas, deep interior of Minas Gerais. The clouds had refused for months to pour their blessing upon the parched earth of Minas Gerais. Joaquim rode along the dusty road, feeling sweat trickle between the wrinkles that the Paraguay War had carved into his still young face of 45 years. Each step of the horse raised a small cloud of red earth, as if the very soul of the region cried out for relief. In the tanned leather saddlebag, he carried hope crystallized in quinine bottles, the only salvation for the fever that had been consuming his little Florinda for 5 days. The 6-year-old girl burned in delirium, calling for saints and angels, while Benedita, her mother, prayed the rosary until the beads wore thin between her calloused fingers. The Portuguese apothecary from São Sebastião had been clear. The epidemic was decimating the region's children like a merciless reaper. Entire families abandoned their lands, following the trails of desperation in search of larger cities, leaving behind only rough wooden crosses and the echo of unanswered prayers. Joaquim pressed his heels against the animal's flank. The sun was beginning to lean westward, painting the sky in orange tones that foretold the night's arrival. He needed to arrive before darkness enveloped the treacherous trails, where desperate men made violence their last resort for survival. Suddenly thunder echoed through the valleys, so strong that his horse stopped, ears pricked. Joaquim raised his eyes and saw in the distant horizon black clouds gathering like warriors ready for battle. The rain, so desired for months, had chosen precisely that moment to return. The first drops began to fall thick and sparse, creating small craters in the dust. In minutes, what was drizzle transformed into torrential downpour. Joaquim knew well that type of storm, characteristic of drought's end, fierce and implacable. Through the curtain of water that now fell in sheets, he glimpsed in the distance the dark entrance of the cave, known by locals as Jaguar's Den. The people's superstitions spoke of hauntings and wandering souls, but Joaquim knew that only stone and shadow awaited him there. It was his only refuge. What secrets would the storm reveal in that solitary night? The darkness of the cave enveloped Joaquim like a cold embrace. The sound of rain outside created a melancholy symphony that echoed through the stone walls. He lit a piece of tallow candle that he always carried in his saddlebag, and the yellowish light danced over the rock formations, creating shadows that moved like spectral figures. It was then that he heard a whisper so low that for a moment he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind inside. He held the candle higher and walked cautiously toward the sound. His leather boots echoed in the humid silence, mixing with the constant dripping of moisture condensing on the cavern's ceiling. At the back of the cave, in a natural depression among the rocks, lay a young woman. Her skin had the waxy pallor of puerperal fever, and in her trembling arms, wrapped in blood-stained rags, a newborn barely breathed. The scene revealed itself before Joaquim like a sacred and terrible apparition, a rustic pietà sculpted by destiny's cruel hand. The woman had her eyes closed, but her lips moved in whispered prayers. Joaquim approached slowly, like one approaching a wounded animal. He could see that she had given birth there alone, on stones covered by dry leaves that someone, herself probably, had gathered to make an improvised bed. "Water," she murmured, without opening her eyes. "Please, water." Joaquim looked at his canteen, still half full. Then he looked at the quinine bottles in his saddlebag. His daughter was dying at home, and he had medicine that could save her. But there before his eyes was a woman who wouldn't last until dawn, and a baby that might not even survive the next hours. The stories they told about that cave returned to his mind. They said it was a place of evil omens, where lost souls came to seek redemption. Perhaps they weren't just superstitions. The woman opened her eyes. They were green like the deep waters of the San Francisco River. For a moment, her gaze met his with a clarity that cut through the fever. "St. John," she whispered, "protect my boy." And Joachim understood that this was no coincidence. In that stormy night, two destinies intertwined in the earth's darkness, and a choice imposed itself before him like a moral crossroads that would define not only his soul, but the future of two innocent children. What would be the price of compassion in that night of revelations? The candle flickered in the cold air current, entering through the rock's crevices, creating a ballet of light and shadow over the dying woman's face. Joachim knelt beside her, feeling the cold dampness of stone pierce through his thick cotton pants. The quinine weighed on his conscience like molten lead. With careful hands, he raised her head and brought the canteen to her parched lips. She drank with the desperate thirst of one who hadn't known the taste of clean water for a long time. Each sip seemed to return a bit of life to those green eyes that fought against death's shadows. "My son," she murmured, looking at the small bundle in her arms. "He was born too early, but he has strength, I feel it." Joachim observed the baby. He was tiny, with the wrinkled skin of those who arrive before their time, but his lungs worked and his small fists moved with life's instinctive determination. There was something in that child that touched him deeply, perhaps the memory of other children that he and Benedita had lost in previous years, victims of the same fever that now threatened Florinda. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Rosalina," she sighed. "Rosalina da Conceição. And he will be Antonio if God wills him to live." Joachim knew that devotion. Saint Anthony of Miracles, protector of lost causes. How many times had he himself not invoked the saint during the bloody days of war, when death prowled the camps like a bird of prey? The rain outside was beginning to diminish, but the storm had transformed the roads into quagmires. Even so, Joachim knew he couldn't remain there until dawn. Florinda needed the medicine before it was too late. "I must go," he said, seeing understanding kindle in Rosalina's gaze. "I know," she whispered. "Take him, please." The words hung in the cave's humid air like a prayer. Joachim felt the weight of that request, not just the physical weight of the baby, but the weight of an entire lifetime of responsibility. But when he looked again at little Antonio, he saw in him the possibility of redemption for his own losses. With careful gestures, he tore a strip from his cotton shirt and improvised a sling. The baby nestled against his chest, surprisingly quiet, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. "Promise me," whispered Rosalina, her strength rapidly fading, "that you will raise him far from violence, far from hatred." "I promise by Our Lady of Aparecida," Joachim replied solemnly. When he left the cave carrying little Antonio with him, dawn was beginning to paint the sky in rosy tones. Behind him, Rosalina closed her eyes for the last time, a serene smile on her lips, knowing her son was safe. Would Joachim manage to save both children that destiny had placed in his hands? The horse galloped along the muddy road, its hooves creating a syncopated rhythm that echoed like hurried heartbeats across the still sleeping landscape. Joachim held the reins with one hand, while the other protected little Antonio against his chest. The baby remained silent, as if he understood the urgency of those moments that would decide between life and death. The first lights of dawn painted golden the water puddles left by the storm, and Joachim could see in the distance the bamboo fence that delimited his property. His heart raced when he spotted Benedita's figure on the porch, still in her nightgown, rosary in her hands and eyes, red from so much crying and praying. She ran to meet him before the horse even stopped completely. Her eyes widened upon seeing the bundle he carried, but concern for Florinda spoke louder. "The medicine?" she asked with a hoarse voice. "Here," Joachim replied, handing her the quinine bottles. "How is our little girl?" "The fever worsened during the night. She's delirious, calling for angels and saints." Benedita stopped, observing the baby more closely. "Joachim, who is this child?" While preparing the quinine mixed with sweetened water for Florinda, Joachim told the story in summary. Benedita listened in silence, feeding the newborn with warm goat's milk mixed with fennel water, her maternal instincts awakening naturally. "It's a sign," she finally said, rocking little Antonio. "Saint Christopher protected your journey and sent this child to our arms." Florinda drank the medicine without resistance, even in her feverish state. The quinine had a bitter taste, but Benedita knew how to sweeten it with wild honey they collected from the beehives in the yard. Within hours, the fever began to subside, and relief spread through the house like jasmine perfume. Little Antonio adapted quickly to the family's routine. Benedita improvised a cradle from a drawer lined with soft cloths, and Florinda, still weak, insisted on helping care for the little brother the angels brought. For 3 days, Joachim observed the transformation in his house. Benedita, who had plunged into deep melancholy after losing 2 children in the previous epidemic, regained the brightness in her eyes. Florinda, strengthening each day, hummed lullabies to the baby, and he himself felt a strange peace, as if an ancient void in his soul had finally found fulfillment. But he knew he needed to return to the cave. Rosalina deserved a Christian burial, and there were practical matters to be resolved. The child needed documents and official identity in the world of men. On the morning of the 4th day, he called his compadre Manuel, ex-war companion and trusted man. "I need your help for a Christian mission," he told him, and Manuel, a man of few words and much understanding, simply nodded. What secrets did the cave still guard, and how would they legitimize little Antonio's presence in their lives? The smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves hung heavy in the air when Joaquim and Manuel arrived at the cave entrance. 3 days had passed since little Antonio's rescue, and now they returned to fulfill their Christian duty toward Rosalina. Manuel carried a hoe, and Joaquim bore a rough wooden cross he had carved during the nights of vigil. The cavern's entrance seemed smaller in daylight, less mysterious and more melancholy. The smell emanating from the interior confirmed what both already knew. Rosalina had departed to meet her creator in the hours following the storm. "May God have her in his glory," Manuel murmured, crossing himself before entering. They found her as Joaquim had foreseen. Death had come gently, for her face was serene, almost smiling. Her hands still held a rosary of dark beads, and beside her, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small bundle that Joaquim hadn't noticed in his first visit's haste. Manuel, who could read from having studied at seminary before going to war, examined the bundle's contents. It was a letter, written in careful feminine handwriting, along with some silver reyes and a medal of Our Lady of the Conception. "She left her story here," Manuel said solemnly, storing the belongings. "We'll read it after the burial." They chose a location near the cave entrance, under a centenary tree whose roots plunged deep into Minas's red earth. There they dug the grave while the sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow over their silent work. Rosalina's body was wrapped in clean cloths that Joaquim had brought from home. Benedita had insisted on contributing her most beautiful shroud, white cotton fabric embroidered with blue flowers that she herself had made when she still dreamed of more children. Before covering the grave, Manuel recited a Latin prayer he had learned in his seminary days. The words echoed among the trees like an ancient blessing, carrying Rosalina's soul on its final journey. Joaquim planted the wooden cross at the head, carving with his knife's tip, "Rosalina da Conceição, mother of Antonio, 1882. I promise by the lady's holy memory," Joaquim said, addressing the grave, "that her son will grow knowing of the love that brought her here." The return journey was made in contemplative silence. Only when they reached Joaquim's house did Manuel open Rosalina's letter. By oil lamplight, he read aloud the story of that courageous woman, daughter of a Diamantina family, who had fled an arranged marriage with a violent colonel, seeking refuge in a convent of nuns in Paracatu. The letter also revealed her last wish, that the child be raised far from the intrigues and violence of the powerful, in a simple, God-fearing family, where love would be stronger than gold and pride. Benedita cried upon hearing the story, and Florinda, even without fully understanding, held little Antonio with even more tenderness. "It truly was God's will," Joaquim murmured, observing his family gathered around the baby, who slept peacefully, oblivious to the extraordinary destiny that had unfolded to bring him there. But how would they make Antonio officially part of the family, in an era when bureaucracy could be as cruel as nature? The municipal seat was 2 leagues away, in an adobe and French tile construction that contrasted with the humble houses around it. Joaquim rode slowly, pondering the words he would use before Colonel Firmino, a man who accumulated the functions of justice of the peace, registrar, and one of the region's greatest authorities. Little Antonio went in his arms, now a week old and already demonstrating the resistance his mother had foreseen. Benedita had dressed him in the finest outfit she had managed to sew from raw cotton fabric embroidered with initials she had invented, ACS, Antonio da Conceição Silva, honoring both the saint and his true mother. Colonel Firmino was a corpulent man, with graying mustaches and a perspicacious gaze that had learned to read human intentions through decades dealing with the complexities of interior life. He received Joaquim in his office, among shelves loaded with dusty legal codes and portraits of Emperor Dom Pedro II. "Foundling, you say?" asked Firmino, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses while observing the baby. "And where exactly did you find the child?" Joaquim had prepared his version of the facts, He had found the baby abandoned on the road during the storm, with no signs of the mother. It was a common story in those difficult times, when desperate families sometimes abandoned children hoping others could give them better conditions. The Empire's laws regarding orphans are clear, the colonel pondered, leafing through a dusty code. An 8-month period must be given for relatives to appear. After that, if no one claims the child, and if a suitable family wishes to adopt it, papers can be arranged. It was a long time, but Joachim knew he needed to follow the law. Colonel Firmino, after examining the family's conditions, own land, absence of significant debts, Christian reputation in the community, agreed to register Antonio as foundling found by Joachim Silva and establish the legal deadline. But baptism, Firmino said, that can be done immediately. Father Amancio will be at St. Peter's Church next Sunday. Sunday came with clear skies and golden sun that warmed the earth still moist from recent rains. The small church of St. Peter, whitewashed with blue details, filled with curious onlookers who came to witness the baptism of the storm child, as they were already calling him. Father Amancio, a kind man with white hair and hands soft as dove wings, poured holy water over Antonio's head while intoning the sacred words. The baby didn't cry. On the contrary, he seemed to smile slightly when the water touched his forehead, as if recognizing the moment's sanctity. Benedita and Florinda were chosen as godmothers, and Manuel accepted the honor of being godfather. Thus Antonio gained not just a family, but an entire community that had witnessed his official entry into the world of the baptized in Christ. After the ceremony, seated on the parochial house's porch, Father Amancio confided his impressions to Joachim. "There is something special about this child," the priest said. "God's ways are mysterious, my son. Sometimes he uses storms to bring blessings." During the following 8 months, what transformations would little Antonio bring to that family's and community's life? The months succeeded one another, like pages of a book written by nature itself. Little Antonio grew strong and clever, his green eyes, Rosalina's inheritance, observing the world with a curiosity that enchanted everyone. Benedita used to say he had eyes of one who has already seen the world, a premature wisdom that manifested in his calm and attentive gaze. Florinda had become his fierce protector and first teacher. At 7 years old, she already knew basic prayers and some songs she had learned from her mother, and insisted on teaching everything to her little brother. During hot afternoons, when work in the fields gave a respite, they would sit under the shade of the centenary mango tree in the yard, and she would show him the first letters written in the earth with sticks. "A for Antonio," she would say solemnly, tracing the letter in the dust. "And A for Angel too, who brought you to us." Joachim observed these scenes with a profound contentment he hadn't felt for a long time. Since Antonio's arrival, the house had filled with new joy. Benedita had recovered the habit of singing while cooking, her Minas songs echoing through the beaten clay kitchen like prayers of gratitude. Florinda herself, who after her illness had become more withdrawn, returned to playing and laughing with childhood's proper spontaneity. Work on the land also prospered. The rain from the storm night had been the beginning of a favorable season. The corn grew tall and vigorous, the pigs fattened in their pens, and Benedita's garden produced vegetables that became famous in the nearby village. It was as if Antonio's arrival had brought a special blessing over the entire property. During Sundays, at St. Peter's Church Mass, the Silva family always sat in the same rough wooden pews. Antonio, even as a baby, remained quiet during ceremonies, as if he understood the moment's solemnity. Father Amancio, when he spotted him, always smiled and made the sign of the cross toward the family. The neighbors, initially curious about the found boy's story, gradually came to accept him as a natural part of the community. Donna Gertrudes, midwife and respected healer in the region, used to say Antonio had the mark of divine protection, a small cross-shaped mark on his right palm, which Benedita interpreted as a sign he was destined for great things. The legal deadline's 8 months passed without any relative appearing to claim the child. Joachim wasn't surprised. The story Manuel had read in Rosalina's letter had made it clear she had come from far away, and her family probably didn't even know of her death or the child's existence. On the exact day the deadline was completed, Joachim returned to Colonel Firmino's registry to finalize the adoption. The bureaucrat, a practical man above all, prepared the documents without ceremony. "Antonio da Conceição Silva," he wrote with careful handwriting in the official register, "adoptive son of Joachim Silva and Benedita Maria da Silva, baptized at St. Peter's Church in 1882, resident at the rural property of Cedar Creek. When Joaquim returned home with the official papers, Benedita cried tears of joy. Now Antonio was officially their son before men's law, just as he already was before God and their hearts. That night, as the family gathered for dinner by lamplight, Joaquim looked around the table and felt his life had found complete meaning. Benedita served creamy polenta with smoked sausage, Florinda helped feed Antonio, and he himself thanked God for the family the storm had given him. But how would it be to reveal to Antonio, when he grew up, the extraordinary journey that had brought him to them? 3 years had passed since the storm night, and Antonio was developing into a clever and observant child. His dark hair had chestnut reflections under the sun, and his green eyes continued to be his most striking feature, always attentive to the movement of people and animals around him. Benedita used to sit with him during gentle afternoons, after household tasks allowed for rest. She was the one who taught him his first letters, using a piece of charcoal on smooth wooden boards. Joaquim had learned to read with difficulty during his army days, but Benedita, daughter of a small merchant, mastered letters with gracefulness and infinite patience. "B for Benedita," she would say, guiding Antonio's small hand over the board. "And B for blessing too, which is what you were for our family." Antonio's first words were Mama and Papa, naturally directed to Benedita and Joaquim, but his third word was Dinda, referring to Florinda, who at 10 years old had officially assumed the role of older sister and protector. Among the three, a family dynamic so natural had been created that no one questioned the child's origins anymore. During the region's religious festivals, St. John, Divine Holy Spirit, Our Lady of the Rosary, the Silva family participated as a cohesive unit. Antonio, dressed in his Sunday clothes made by Benedita from simple but well-cared-for fabrics, played with other children in church courtyards, while adults talked about harvests and rains. It was during one of these festivals that Joaquim noticed how Antonio demonstrated peculiar intelligence. The boy, only 3 years old, could memorize entire prayers just by hearing them once, and showed an understanding of social relationships that surprised adults. "Papa," he asked one afternoon, while watching Joaquim fix a broken fence, "why do some people have land and others don't?" The question caught Joaquim off guard. How to explain to a 3-year-old child the complexities of a world where some were born heirs to farms, while others were born to work as tenants? How to speak of justice and injustice to someone who still saw the world with childhood's purity? "Because God gives to each according to their need and capacity," Joaquim answered carefully. "Our land is small, but it's enough for our family to live with dignity. What's important is not having much, but using well what one has." Antonio nodded with seriousness that seemed disproportionate to his age, as if he understood layers of meaning he couldn't yet express. As he grew, he also developed a special connection with the property's animals. The pigs came to eat from his hand, the chickens followed him around the yard, and even Joaquim's horse, normally skittish with strangers, allowed the boy to pet him without fear. "He has a gift with animals," Manuel observed during his Sunday visits. "It's a sign of a clean soul." Benedita began teaching him basic household tasks, how to help in the garden, separate bean grains, feed the chickens. Antonio embraced each task with seriousness and dedication, always asking why about things, always wanting to understand the reason behind each activity. When he turned 4, Joaquim decided it was time to begin preparing the boy for the truth about his origin. Not the whole truth, that would wait until he was older, but an adapted version that would gradually prepare him to understand his story. It was a June night during St. Anthony's feast, when Joaquim sat with his son on the porch, watching the bonfires that glowed in the distance. "Antonio," he said carefully, "do you know why you have St. Anthony's name?" The boy shook his head, interested. "Because St. Anthony protects children who need help, and you, my son, were a very special child that God placed in our path." Antonio listened attentively, his green eyes reflecting the full moon's light. "Didn't I grow in Mama Benedita's belly?" he asked with age-appropriate simplicity. "You grew in her heart," Joaquim replied, "which is sometimes an even more special place." What other secrets about his origin would Antonio discover as he grew? The years succeeded one another like well-defined seasons in the Silva family's life. Antonio grew not just in height and weight, but in understanding of the world around him. At 8 years old, he already mastered basic reading and could help Joaquim with the property's simple accounts. How many bushels of corn were planted? How many pigs were sold at the fair? How much the new tools cost? During this period, Brazil was going through profound transformations that reached even the Minas interior. Conversations at Seu Zezinho's store, the region's men's meeting point, increasingly revolved around the slavery question and rumors about its possible abolition. Joaquim participated in these discussions with the caution of one who had seen the world beyond the farm's limits. His experience in the Paraguay War had given him a different perspective on freedom and human dignity. At home, he taught his children that all men were equal before God, regardless of skin color or social condition. Antonio absorbed these lessons with a seriousness that impressed adults. When he witnessed groups of fugitive slaves being pursued by bush captains, he asked questions Joaquim considered too deep for his age. "Why can some men own others, Papa?" he had asked on one occasion. "They can't, son. Only God owns men. The rest is ignorance and greed disguised as law." These conversations always happened during fieldwork, when father and son walked through corn rows or cared for animals. Joaquim noticed that Antonio had a special ability to relate moral lessons to life's practical situations, demonstrating a maturity that seemed inherited from birth. During religious festivals, Antonio stood out among the community's children. He participated in the church's children's choirs, where his clear voice stood out during hymns. Father Amancio, now older with completely white hair, used to comment to Joaquim about the boy's natural vocation for sacred things. "This boy has an apostle's soul," the priest would say. "Perhaps God is calling him to a special mission." But Joaquim observed that Antonio's mission seemed to be precisely his ability to unite people. In the house's yard, neighborhood children gathered to hear the stories he told, adaptations of tales he had learned from Benedita, always with morals about goodness and justice. Even adults, when passing by, would stop to listen. It was at 10 years old that Antonio asked the question Joaquim knew would come one day. "Papa, why don't I look like you or Dinda?" They were by the creek, fishing lambaris for dinner. The question came casually, but Joaquim felt the weight of responsibility for an honest answer. "What do you mean, son? My eyes are green, yours are brown, my hair is lighter. And I'm smaller than Dinda, even though I'm only a few years younger." Joaquim breathed deeply, looking at the creek's clear waters where silver fish swam unhurriedly. "Antonio, do you remember that conversation we had about St. Anthony protecting special children?" The boy nodded. "Well, you were one of those special children. Your mother, your first mother, couldn't take care of you when you were born. So God sent you to us, so we could be your family." Antonio remained silent for long minutes, processing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice was serene, without the drama Joaquim expected. "Was she a good person?" "She was a very brave woman, full of love. So much love she was capable of making the greatest sacrifice a mother can make, ensuring her son would have a better life than she could offer." "And can I find her someday?" Joaquim felt his heart tighten. "She's no longer among us, son, but I believe she watches us from heaven and is happy seeing how you've grown strong and good." Antonio nodded again, with the same serenity. "So I have two mothers, one in heaven and one here on earth." Exactly. How would this revelation change the way Antonio saw himself and his family? The revelation about his origin didn't disturb Antonio, as Joaquim had feared. On the contrary, it seemed to complete a puzzle the boy had been assembling in his observant mind. In the days following the conversation by the creek, he continued calling Joaquim and Benedita father and mother with the same affection as always, but began demonstrating new curiosity about the world beyond the farm. "Papa, what was she like?" he asked one morning, while helping Joaquim repair the granary roof. "Beautiful, with green eyes like yours. And brave, very brave." Joaquim hammered the nail carefully before continuing. "She came from far away, from a big city, looking for a safe place for you to be born. Why couldn't she raise me?" Joaquim stopped work and looked at his son. At 10 years old, Antonio already demonstrated a capacity for understanding that allowed deeper conversations. "Sometimes, son, people are born into families where there's much violence, much hatred. Your first mother wanted you to grow up in a family where love and peace reigned. That's why God guided her to us." This explanation seemed to satisfy Antonio, who resumed his work helping hold the tiles. But Joaquim realized the seed of curiosity had been planted and knew that one day he would need to tell the complete story. During the following years, the family's life followed its natural rhythm. Antonio developed special skills for dealing with land and animals. His intuition for predicting weather changes surprised even the most experienced neighbors. "The boy reads the sky like a book," Sir Manuel would comment. Florinda, now a 15-year-old young woman, had assumed many domestic responsibilities, allowing Benedita to dedicate more time to Antonio's education. Classes happened on the porch during afternoons, using books borrowed from the priest and improvised materials that family creativity created. It was during this period that news about the Golden Law reached the region. May 13, 1888, was celebrated at St. Peter's Church with a special Mass, and Father Amancio spoke of a new time of freedom and Christian responsibility. Antonio, now 6 years old, understood the historical moment's magnitude. During the walk home, he made an observation that surprised Joachim. "Now all God's children can choose their own destiny, right, Papa?" "That's right, my son. Freedom means being able to choose to do good." This conversation happened while they passed by the cave where Rosalina had been buried. Joachim kept the place clean and the cross always in good condition, but had never taken Antonio there. The boy, however, always demonstrated strange attraction to the region. "Why do we always come this way, Papa?" "It's the most beautiful path," Joachim would answer, which wasn't a lie. The trail really offered magnificent valley views. At 12 years old, Antonio had already assumed significant responsibilities on the property. He cared for the garden alone, helped at weekly village fairs, and had begun learning basic carpentry skills with Manuel. His reputation as a responsible and intelligent boy had spread throughout the community. During the June festivals of 1893, when he was turning 11, an episode occurred that revealed much about his character. A family of refugees had arrived in the region fleeing the northeast drought, with sick and hungry children. Antonio, without consulting his parents, took them half of his personal corn harvest, the part Joachim had promised he could sell to buy a horse. "Why did you do that, son?" Joachim asked, more curious than irritated. "The horse can wait, Papa, but those children needed to eat today." That night, Joachim told Benedita about the episode. She smiled with pride and said something he would never forget. "The mother who bore him left in him the mark of goodness. We just helped polish it." But what trials still awaited the family, and how would they test the values they had cultivated together? The year 1897 brought changes that no one in the Silva family expected. Joachim, now 55 years old, began presenting a persistent cough that worsened with heavy work. Benedita, always attentive to the body's signals, insisted he seek medical help in the city. Dr. Henrique, a doctor trained in São Paulo who had established himself in the region, was clear in his diagnosis after examining Joachim: tuberculosis, the disease that claimed lives mainly among the poorest. Treatment consisted of rest, nutritious food, and fresh air. Ironies for a man who had always lived from working the land and already breathed the purest air that existed. Antonio, now 15 years old, immediately understood the situation's gravity. Without anyone asking, he assumed the property's heaviest tasks, rising before dawn to care for the animals and working until after sunset in the fields. Florinda, already married to a village merchant, came daily to help Benedita with medical care. During the months that followed, Joachim alternated between periods of improvement and severe relapses. It was during moments of lucidity that he took advantage to transmit to Antonio the last teachings he judged important. "Son," he said one August afternoon, while they rested on the porch observing the work Antonio had done alone in the garden, "the time has come for you to know your entire story." Antonio stopped shucking corn and looked at his father with respectful attention. "Your mother, your first mother, was named Rosalina da Conceição. She came from Diamantina, fleeing a life she didn't want for herself or for you." During the following hours, Joachim told the complete story: the storm night, the encounter in the cave, the letter revealing Rosalina's past, the Christian burial. Antonio listened in silence, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his maturity. "Did she die alone?" he asked, and Joachim detected deep sadness in the young man's voice. "No, son. She died knowing you were safe. For a mother, there is no more peaceful death. Can I see the place where she was buried?" The next day, despite his weakness, Joachim insisted on accompanying Antonio to the cave. It was the first time the young man visited the place where his story had begun. Before the simple grave marked by the wooden cross Joachim always kept in good condition, Antonio knelt and prayed silently for long minutes. "Thank you, Mother Rosalina," he finally whispered, "for giving me such a good family." Joachim watched emotionally the adoptive son's spiritual maturity. At 15 years old, Antonio demonstrated an understanding of life and death that many adults didn't possess. During Joachim's illness's final months, Antonio proved to be not just a dedicated son, but a responsible man. He administered the property with wisdom, cared for his sick father with tenderness, and still found time to console Benedita in her moments of greatest anguish. "You became the man I dreamed you would be," Joachim said in one of the last lucid conversations they had. "I learned from the best teacher," Antonio replied, holding the calloused hand that had guided him throughout life. Joachim died on a spring morning, surrounded by family. Antonio closed his eyes with the same delicacy with which Joachim had cared for Rosalina years before. The funeral gathered the entire community, proof of the respect the simple man had conquered through a life of righteousness. Father Amancio, now very elderly, conducted the ceremony with special emotion. "Joachim Silva was a man who understood the true meaning of fatherhood," he said during the homily. "He didn't just father children, but formed souls." After the burial, Antonio remained for a few minutes before the grave, now responsible for a family and a legacy of values he knew he needed to preserve. How would young Antonio face the challenges of becoming head of household at such a young age? Joachim's death marked the end of an era for the Silva family, but also the beginning of a new phase that would reveal all the strength of values planted over the years. Antonio, at 17 years old, officially assumed responsibility for the property and care of Benedita, who at 52 still had energy to help, but needed emotional support to overcome the loss of her lifelong companion. The first months were of difficult adaptation. Antonio needed to learn to negotiate with village merchants, understand credit and payment cycles, and make decisions that were previously shared with Joachim. Benedita, observing the adoptive son face these challenges, saw in him reflections of the man who had raised them, the same serenity before difficulties, the same honesty in business, the same genuine concern for the family's welfare. During this period, historical changes continued transforming the country. The Republic's proclamation in 1889 altered political structures, but in the Minas interior changes arrived slowly, filtered by local colonels who adapted new laws to old customs. Antonio, however, demonstrated sharp understanding of these transformations. "Times are changing, Mother," he told Benedita during evening conversations on the porch. "It's no longer enough just to work the land. One must understand how this new world works." It was this understanding that led him to diversify the property's activities. Besides traditional crops, he began raising dairy cattle and producing cheeses that soon gained fame in the region. He also established a small carpentry workshop, using skills he had learned from Manuel to manufacture furniture and tools he sold at the weekly fair. The modest but solid prosperity he managed to build caught the attention of several families in the region, who began considering Antonio a good match for their daughters. But it was during the Our Lady of the Rosary festival in 1902 that he met Isaura, daughter of an Italian immigrant family that had established itself on a neighboring property. Isaura was 19 years old, with light brown hair and blue eyes that contrasted with skin lightly bronzed by the Minas sun. More than her beauty, what attracted Antonio was her intelligence and determination. Daughter of hard-working people who had left Italy seeking better opportunities, she knew how to value work's dignity and family's importance. The courtship was conducted according to the era's customs, conversations on the porch under Benedita's watchful eye, walks to church accompanied by Florinda, letters exchanged through respectable intermediaries. Antonio revealed himself as a respectful and sincere suitor, qualities that won not just Isaura, but her entire family. During one of these courtship conversations, Antonio told Isaura his true story. Her reaction revealed much about her character. "That only proves you were chosen by God to be special," she said simply, "and that your adoptive parents were blessed for having known how to recognize that choice." The wedding took place in the spring of 1903 at St. Peter's Church, decorated with field flowers the community itself had gathered. Father Amancio, now over 80 years old but still lucid, conducted the ceremony with special emotion. "Antonio," he said during the nuptial blessing, "you were born from a storm and grew in a family of love. Now form your own family with the same wisdom you received." The celebration lasted 2 days, with music, dance, and abundant food. The entire region attended. In a demonstration of respect and affection, Antonio had won. During the celebration, he made sure to take Isaura to Rosalina's grave, in a symbolic gesture of presenting his wife to the mother who had given life for him. The couple's first children were born quickly: João in 1904, followed by Maria in 1906, Luis in 1908, and Anna in 1910. Antonio proved to be a dedicated father, applying with his own children the same principles he had learned from Joachim and Benedita. Unconditional love, just discipline, solid education, and Christian values. During family gatherings, it became tradition for Antonio to tell his children the story of how he had arrived at that family. The children listened fascinated to the narrative of the storm, the mysterious cave, and Rosalina and Joachim's courage. "We have a special grandmother in heaven," little Maria would say, at 5 years old, demonstrating how the story had naturally integrated into family identity. How would this new generation perpetuate the values transmitted through so many trials and conquests? The year 1916 brought winds of change that would blow over the Silva family like distant echoes of the Great War devastating Europe. Benedita, now 72 years old, remained lucid and active, but her health had begun to decline during the harsh winter months that preceded that memorable year. During an August afternoon, while helping Izora prepare fruit preserves for winter, Benedita had a sudden weakness that made her sit heavily in a porch chair. Antonio, now 34 years old and recognized as one of the region's most respected men, immediately perceived this was a sign he couldn't ignore. "My son," Benedita said that night when the family gathered for dinner, "my time has come to take a long journey. But before departing, I want to make some things very clear." The younger grandchildren, João at 12, Maria at 10, Luis at 8, and Anna at 6, listened with seriousness that exceeded their ages. Benedita had been not just grandmother, but second mother to all of them, transmitting the same lessons of goodness and wisdom she had taught Antonio. "Do you know the story of how Papa Antonio came to our family?" she asked the children. "We know, Grandma," Maria replied, the siblings' natural spokesperson. "He came in a storm and God sent him to you." "Exactly. And do you know why?" The children shook their heads, curious. "Because God had a special plan. He wanted Papa Antonio to grow in a family that knew how to teach what really matters in life, not having much, but sharing what you have, not being important, but doing important things, not living long, but living well." Antonio felt his eyes fill with tears hearing these words. Benedita continued, now addressing him directly. "And now it's your turn to continue that plan, my son. Times are changing. That war over there in Europe will change the entire world, and even here in the interior we'll feel these changes. But if you keep alive the values you learned, if you continue being a family united by love and not by interest, if you always remember that each person who crosses our path might need help, then Rosalina's sacrifice and Joachim's goodness will continue living." During the days that followed, Benedita gradually weakened, but maintained lucidity until the end. She called each grandchild individually for private conversations, transmitting to each specific advice they would carry for life. To João, the eldest, she taught about responsibility. To Maria, about the importance of education for women. To Luis, about justice and compassion. To little Anna, about preserving joy even in difficulties. On her deathbed, surrounded by family, Benedita made a final request to Antonio. "Promise me you'll take your children to see Rosalina's grave. Promise they'll always know where they come from and where they should go." "I promise, Mother," Antonio replied, holding the hand that had guided his childhood, "and also promise that if you ever find someone in difficulties, like Joachim found you and your first mother, you'll do the same thing. Love needs to keep circulating through the world." Benedita died that dawn, in peace, with a serene smile on her lips. Antonio understood he wasn't just losing the adoptive mother who had raised him, he was receiving the responsibility of being guardian of a goodness legacy that needed to be transmitted. The funeral gathered hundreds of people. People from throughout the region came to pay homage to the woman who had touched their lives with small gestures of goodness over decades. Father Amancio, now over 90 years old and visibly frail, insisted on personally conducting the ceremony. Benedita Silva, he said during the homily, was a woman who understood that motherhood is not just bearing children, but forming souls for good. She leaves a son who wasn't born from her womb, but who is the perfect fruit of her heart. After the burial, when the family returned home, Antonio gathered wife and children on the porch, where so many lessons had been learned. "From now on," he said solemnly, "we are responsible for keeping alive the story that brought us here. Not just our family's story, but the story that good always finds a way to continue." In that moment, contemplating the children he had fathered and educated according to the values he had received, Antonio finally understood the full magnitude of the divine plan that had intertwined his life with Joachim's, Benedita's, and Rosalina's. How would this understanding forever transform the way Antonio lived his remaining years? The years following Benedita's death were of consolidating the spiritual heritage she had left. Antonio, now recognized as family patriarch and respected figure throughout the region, dedicated himself not just to prospering economically, but to perpetuating the values that had transformed an abandoned baby in a storm into an upright and prosperous man. During the decades of 1920 and 1930, the world went through profound transformations. The Revolution of 1930, political and social changes that modernized Brazil, the arrival of the railroad that connected the region to big cities. Antonio adapted to these changes, maintaining his principles intact, demonstrating it was possible to progress without losing one's soul. His children grew incorporating naturally the fundamental lesson they had learned. Each person who crossed their path should be treated with dignity, especially those in vulnerable situations. João became a prosperous merchant, but known for his absolute honesty in business. Maria, defying the era's patterns, studied to be a teacher and dedicated herself to educating poor children in the region. Luis followed his father's path in agriculture, but always with doors open to needy families. Ana married a doctor, and together they created a small hospital that served the poorest for free. The tradition of annually visiting Rosalina's grave established itself as the family's sacred ritual. Every May 13th, date of slavery abolition, symbolically chosen to represent liberation, the entire family walked to the cave, now transformed into a small sanctuary that attracted pilgrims from throughout the region. There, before the simple cross Joaquim had carved decades before, Antonio told the story to grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and family dependents who joined the pilgrimage. The narrative, perfected over the years, had become a living lesson about divine providence, maternal sacrifice, and human goodness. Rosalina da Conceição, Antonio would say, now a man with graying hair, chose life instead of ease, love instead of fear. Joaquim and Benedita chose compassion instead of indifference, and we today choose to continue this chain of goodness. During the 1940s, when the world plunged again into war, the silver property became refuge for several families fleeing poverty and violence. Antonio, following the example he had received, never refused help to those who needed it. He built small houses on the property to shelter workers and their families, created a school for the region's children, and established a kind of cooperative that allowed small farmers to sell their products at fair prices. Isaura, faithful companion during all these decades, proved fundamental in consolidating this legacy. Her Italian background brought organizational discipline that allowed the family's generosity to be sustainable and lasting. Together, she and Antonio demonstrated that prosperity and solidarity could walk hand in hand. In 1950, when he turned 68, Antonio gathered the entire family, children, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, adult grandchildren, and small great-grandchildren, for a special conversation. It was the day that marked exactly 68 years since the storm night that had changed his destiny. "I lived a good life," he said, seated on the same porch where he had learned the first lessons from Joaquim and Benedita. "But a good life isn't one where storms don't happen. It's one where we know how to find shelter in storms and offer shelter to others who are lost in the rain." His green eyes, now surrounded by wrinkles that told stories of smiles and worries, shone with the same intensity as in youth. "Each of you carries within yourself a part of this story. Don't let it die. Don't let the world become so modern that it forgets simple goodness. Don't let people become so busy building fortunes that they forget to build character." In the spring of that year, Antonio suddenly fell ill. As had happened with Joaquim, he faced death with serenity, surrounded by the love of those he had helped form. His last words were a whisper directed to the crucifix on the wall. "Thank you, Lord, for the storm that changed my life." Antonio da Conceição Silva's funeral was the largest the region had ever witnessed. People from throughout the Minas interior came to pay homage to the man who had transformed an act of compassion into a philosophy of life. On the tombstone they carved the words he had requested. "Here lies one who learned that true love is that which multiplies when divided." Years later, decades later, the story continued being told. Antonio's descendants spread throughout Brazil, carrying with them the values they had learned. The small property became a pilgrimage center. Rosalina's cave transformed into an official diocesan sanctuary, and the lesson that a gesture of goodness can change history's course continued echoing through generations. Because some storms don't destroy, they reveal who we truly are and give us the opportunity to become who we should be.